God created the heaven and the earth. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life." And God created every living creature that hath life. So vivid was the biblical account of creation that up to the 18th century, the concept of an unchanging world was fixed firmly in the minds of Christians and most scientists. Using the Bible as a record of time, theologians had calculated that the earth was very young. One professor had actually pinned down the day of creation at 9 o'clock, October 23rd, 4004 BC. Because the period of creation was measured in a matter of 6 days, most scientists accepted as fact that the original forms of all living things were created at the same time. Taking the Bible as his guide, the idea of a perfect world designed by a creator would be powerfully argued by one Bishop Paley. Imagine, he asks, that you had never seen a watch. You would have to assume this intricate object had been designed by an intelligent creature. Now, look at the human eye. Anything as perfect as this lens could not have evolved on its own. Indeed, anything as complicated as nature must have been designed by a creator with a purpose. Behind his purpose was an order of being made to serve him. Fixed and unchanging, all beings were ranked in ascending order. From the lowest forms of being to the highest. This divine ranking was called the Great Chain of Being. However, by the mid-18th century, there was one naturalist who saw a different pattern of creation. Carl Linnaeus, concerned as much with earthly matters as heavenly, compared living things according to shared characteristics. He divided plants and animals into orders, families, genera, and species, and provided the basis of today's expanded taxonomy. Linnaeus used genus and species to identify and name an organism. His taxonomy, still used today, prodded scientists into looking at things very differently. If species were related through genus, could species have evolved from some form of prototype? The question caused the creation model to creak a little. During this period, there was another assault on the notion of divine or special creation. The newfangled microscope, coupled with crude experiments, would reveal some serious flaws in the theory of fixed species. Believing that they had carefully sterilized their flasks, scientists boiled up a meat broth, only to observe days later a soup crawling with organisms. These results seem to suggest that life could arise spontaneously from a mix of organic material. Enter at this time Le Comte de Buffon, who, using this erroneous information, came very close to formulating a modern theory of evolution. After the Earth had cooled down, he speculated that from the primordial mix, basic ancestral life forms arose spontaneously. As any one of these ancient forms, such as the cat, migrated about the Earth, its basic form would be modified by the creature's response to its environment. The original form, acting like a template, gave rise to what Buffon called degenerate types.
Pardon?
Buffon had hit upon two very modern notions. A species could diverge from an ancestral form, and a species could be modified by the environment. But there was another contemporary of his who saw in the pattern of nature progression rather than regression. Lamarck believed that each type of life form is the result of spontaneous generation. Beginning as a microscopic germ, the life form is driven by a need to become complex. Modification takes generations. Because the amphibian is simpler than the mammal, it must have had a later start. And lower forms later still. As for simple forms that abound, they would have originated quite recently. In Lamarck's scheme, living things form a hierarchy, similar in many respects to the chain of being. However, each type of organism advances separately and continues to do so. But if his theory of parallel evolution was going to stand up, he needed a mechanism to explain how species could be modified. The mechanism he proposed was the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Imagine a herd of hungry giraffes. Now, one giraffe wishing to reach the food in the higher trees would have to stretch its neck. This constant effort to stretch its neck would affect its anatomy. When this creature with the longer neck bred, it would pass on the characteristic of long-neckedness. The offspring, in turn, would try to stretch its neck, until over generations, giraffes would take on elongated necks. Conversely, if an animal had no occasion to exercise a particular organ or appendage, over generations, the disused appendage would wilt away. Lamarck's theory, whereby habit modifies form, strongly influenced scientific thought. And it still does today, because its appeal rests with the implied idea that evolution is directed. There is a strong conviction that evolution is not a matter of blind chance. Life is guided by an inward drive, which propels an organism towards a higher form. A few scientists detected more mysticism than hard fact to Lamarck's theory. Besides, if the Earth were merely a few thousand years old, how could a species evolve in so short a time? Nevertheless, it was the pioneer work of these scientists in the early 18th century and 19th century which set the stage for this revolutionary thinker whose speculation about the modification of the species would trouble paradise. By the turn of the 19th century, it was still generally believed that plant and animal species were the result of special creation. Bishop Paley's argument for divine creation seems self-evident to the best of minds, except for a young student who found its scientific value useless. Charles Darwin rather than delighting in philosophy, devoted his time to collecting beetles in particular, and was obsessed with the strongest desire to explain what he observed. After graduation, his love of natural science led him to a posting as a naturalist on the HMS Beagle. During his 5-year epic voyage, Darwin was struck by the variety and distribution of life he discovered in South America. A year after his return, a germ of an idea sprang from his experience. But wanting to heap evidence upon evidence to bolster this idea, this cautious man would take over a quarter of a century to publish one of the most revolutionary of scientific theories, the origin of species. Species, he states in the first chapter, are lineal descendants of some extinct species. With that opening volley, Darwin hoped to prove that the notion of independently created creatures was wrong. Everywhere Darwin looked, he saw variation. Turning to the familiar, he reminds his readers that horse breeders have been selecting what is both useful and pleasing to them for centuries. I cannot, he states, believe that the dray horse and the racehorse were suddenly created as perfectly as they are. Probably intending to shock some sense into his stodgy readers, he suggests that even primitive man appreciated the value of selection. Furthermore, primitive man understood that the offspring of domestic animals inherit the characteristics of the parents. Nature, by laws unknown, he admits, produces variation. From these variants, man selects what pleases him. Over the passage of time, the more he keeps and breeds these favorable variants, the more the modification accumulates in the desired direction. This process Darwin called accumulative selection. As he turns to the natural world, Darwin becomes his poetic best. From the humblest parasite which clings to the feathers of a bird, in the plumaged seed which is wafted by the gentlest breeze, we see beautiful adaptations everywhere. Without the selective hand of man, what is the principle that enables nature to produce these excellent results? At this juncture, Darwin is inspired by Thomas Malthus, who established that all living forms have the power to increase exponentially. What would happen, Darwin muses, if a pair of the slowest breeders, the elephant, were to breed unchecked? Within 500 years, the Earth would be stampeded by 15 million of the beasts. All organisms, vegetable and animal, tend to increase in this manner. What then checks their increasing numbers? The truth for Darwin was what he coined the struggle for existence. The struggle between members of the same species and the struggle between members of different species. Darwin acknowledges that there were a host of complex interrelated factors that could make up the struggle. Harsh climate reduces numbers, and scarce food supply takes its toll, until populations reach equilibrium. So, more individuals are produced than can possibly survive. Now, within a species, there always occurs variation. And the variation which tends to preserve the individual will be inherited by the offspring. The offspring, with the inherited advantage, will thus have a better chance of survival. The principle by which each slight variation is preserved if useful and rejected if injurious, Darwin calls natural selection. Thomas Huxley, an intellectual giant of the times, after reading The Origin of Species, exclaimed, "How stupid of me not to have thought of it." Among the strongest arguments Darwin uses to shore up his theory of evolution is fossil evidence. The succession of extinct species that appear to be the ancestral forms of living creatures. Many pious scientists, however, were unimpressed with his line of thinking. Extinct creatures had simply been trapped in Noah's flood and embedded in the rock, they asserted. But Darwin could not accept this notion of catastrophe. Instead, he was influenced by the work of Charles Lyell, who propounded the idea of uniformitarianism. While the word is a mouthful, the doctrine is simple. Geological activities are uniform. The processes we see at work today are the very same processes that formed the ancient world. And Darwin held this unshakable view. A man must for years examine for himself great piles of strata and watch the sea at work grinding down old rocks and making fresh sediment before he can hope to comprehend anything of the lapse of time. And in this geological succession, Darwin saw organic succession. Just as geological change is slow and unrelenting, so organic evolution proceeds inexorably. Natural selection is hourly scrutinizing throughout the world every variation, even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad, and preserving and adding up all that is good. Genera, he concludes, must have branched off from a common parent at a remote epoch. Darwin could feel, could sense the millions upon millions of years of natural selection at work. Ample time for great climactic and geographical change, where creatures became modified in relation to the new conditions. Darwin had discovered a grand design, and the grand design was natural selection. When The Origin of Species was published in 1859, it was not well received. With few exceptions, Darwin's arguments for evolution only hardened scientists' positions. The prime weakness of Darwin's theory was his inability to explain how characteristics were transferred. When what Darwin called a wondrous monster would occur in a population, if the type were adaptable or fit, only his progeny should survive. Not so, Darwin's detractors argued. The process of natural selection is too slow. When this hairy type breeds with a bald, the results would be an in-between. And when the in-between type breeds within a greater population of bald, in a few generations, the hairy characteristics would be blended out. Ironically, the argument against blending out could have been destroyed had Darwin troubled himself to read Gregor Mendel. Interested in the hard facts of heredity, Mendel experimented with the common pea plant. One of the many characteristics the pea plant exhibits is two distinct seed shapes: round and wrinkled. Selecting a pure strain of each variety, round and wrinkled, he cross-pollinated the plants. Now, prevailing wisdom predicted that the results would be an in-between variety, except that the next generation yielded only round seeds. To test whether the wrinkled trait had vanished, he allowed the plants of the first hybrid generation to self-pollinate. Lo and behold, the wrinkled variety reappeared in the second hybrid generation. As often as he repeated the experiments, he always obtained a ratio of 3 round to 1 wrinkled. The genius of Mendel was simplicity itself. He assigned to the germ plasm of each pure variety 2 paired particles, which he called factors. The pure strain of the round variety contains 2 dominant factors, designated by uppercase R's. The recessive factors are contained in the wrinkled variety. These are designated with lowercase r's. In sexual reproduction, the pollen and egg contribute only one of the 2 factors. So when the one pure variety is fertilized with another pure variety, the only possible combination contains one of each factor, a dominant and a recessive. However, this first generation hybrid manifests only the dominant trait, namely roundness. Now, when these factors combine in reproduction to produce future offspring, each hybrid parent will contribute one of 2 possible factors. But because each hybrid parent has 2 different factors, there are now 4 ways these factors can combine. The combination of 2 dominant factors produces the dominant round form. The dominant factor from one parent may combine with the recessive factor from the other parent. In this case, the dominant factor, roundness, will prevail. Or, the recessive factor from one parent may combine with the dominant factor from this parent, and again the dominant factor, roundness, is expressed. In only one case, when the recessive factor from one parent combines with the recessive factor from the other parent, does the wrinkled form prevail. Hence the famous Mendelian ratio, 3 to 1, 3 times as many round peas as wrinkled. So, Mendel could have provided Darwin with the ammunition he needed. Units of heredity are not blended, but rather preserved. Today, Mendel's term, factor, has been replaced with the term gene, the unit of heredity. And the constituent parts of the gene are called alleles. He enabled us to draw a distinction between the phenotype, the appearance of the organism, resulting from the genotype, the genetic makeup of an organism. Even 30 years after Mendel published his work, many scientists persisted in believing that in large breeding populations, the dominant gene would eventually eliminate the recessive gene. If the polka dot gene were dominant, would it eventually take over the bald recessive type? Surprisingly, the answer is no, if we are able to seal off the population from exterior influences. In 1908, G.H. Hardy scribbled on a napkin this mathematical expression. It demonstrated that the ratio of dominant to recessive would remain constant. If it looks familiar, it's the binomial theorem, which you probably thought wasn't very useful. Let's visualize the way alleles from hybrid parents combine in reproduction. Let P represent the frequency of the dominant allele, and Q represent the frequency of the recessive allele. Simple substitution: P in the place of uppercase R, Q in the place of lowercase r. A little multiplication, a little mop-up, and a little more. Now we'll put the equation together. And quickly clean it up. Our population is 100%, so we can substitute the number 1. Oh, so elegant. But perhaps you're not yet convinced. Imagine a gene pool. In it, the dominant allele is carried by 80% of the male gametes, and the recessive allele by 20%. Likewise, the dominant allele is carried by 80% of the female gametes, and the recessive by 20%. The chance of a dominant coupling is determined by multiplying 80% by 80%, rendering 64%. A recessive coupling involves the same mathematical exercise to produce 4%. This is, of course, exactly what is expressed by the theorem where P equals 80% and Q equals 20%. We'll tidy up the math and return to graphic 4. No matter how much a population expands, this ratio will remain constant as long as the population isn't disturbed. The Hardy-Weinberg law is a theoretical model that illustrates how genes are distributed and preserved. The gene frequencies for a population come to equilibrium under strict conditions. The population must be exceedingly large, and the creatures permitted to breed randomly. In other words, no sexual selection occurs. But if one phenotype can never replace another, doesn't the model contradict Darwin? To the contrary, the Hardy-Weinberg model acts as a barometer to indicate something is happening to the population. If the Harrys flourish, as the Baldies expire, perhaps Darwin's natural selection is at work. But the big question remains: how does a wondrous monster pop out of the population in the first place? By the middle of the 19th century, Gregor Mendel had unlocked the secrets of heredity. He showed that a trait like roundness in a pea did not blend with a wrinkled trait. Mendel proposed that factors, which we now call genes, survive intact from generation to generation and preserve roundness and wrinkledness in fixed mathematical proportion. Mendel explained how a trait, or phenotype, could suddenly reappear in a population. Because the genes which produce variations are hidden and survive from generation to generation, they occasionally produce a different phenotype. A change in the environment might favor one variation over another. Slowly, natural selection, acting on this phenotype, could bring about the evolution of the species. Mendel's work was a theoretical description of how variation might occur, but neither Mendel nor Darwin were aware of the actual mechanism which could produce variation. It would take the work of many cell biologists to reveal the actual mechanism of variation. Around the beginning of this century, scientists began to suspect that the chromosomes contain the genetic information which determines both the function and appearance of the organism. Here is what biologists observed. Prior to a cell's division, chromosomes within the nucleus would first replicate, line up, and then separate. Finally, one member of the replicate goes to each of the daughter cells. This process is called mitosis. While this method of cell reproduction guarantees continuity, mitosis certainly doesn't provide the variation necessary to fuel evolution. Possessing the identical genetic material of the parent, the offspring would remain mere copies of the parent. In terms of evolution, mitosis is a relatively blind end. It was nature's invention of sexual reproduction that enabled organisms to generate variability. When two gametes fuse during fertilization, each parent contributes its complementary half of the genetic information to the offspring. But first, there was a hurdle that nature had to overcome. All cells, except gametes, in sexually reproducing organisms are diploid. That is, they contain a set of chromosomes from each parent. We can represent this mathematically by assigning n to each set of chromosomes. If we start with two diploid gametes, an egg and a sperm, and each contributes its full complement of chromosomes, fertilization would produce a tetraploid offspring, and the next generation an octoploid, until we might imagine a cell overstuffed with chromosomes. If sexual reproduction were to be successful, the diploid organism needed to reduce its number of chromosomes as it divided. And how, then, does nature carry out the act? Let us suppose a hypothetical diploid cell contains both the dominant allele and recessive allele for a given trait. During the primary stages, the chromosomes replicate exactly and pair up. In the secondary stages, the chromosomes migrate in opposite directions, and two cells are formed. Finally, these two cells divide again, and this time, the duplicate chromosomes separate to form 4 haploid cells. These 4 haploid cells are gametes. And meiosis is the name given to the process we've just watched. In meiosis, a single diploid cell becomes 4 gametes. Now, when a female gamete combines with one of these male gametes, note how the diploid configuration is restored with a chromosome from each parent. That's a simple model of meiosis. Now consider a more likely diploid cell containing not one, but several pairs of chromosomes. Each of these pairs will, through meiosis, eventually contribute 1 chromosome to each of the 4 gametes. Now, which chromosomes from which pair will wind up together in the same gamete? Impossible to tell, because meiosis, like a giant slot machine, selects them by random assortment. Suppose each window represents a different chromosome pair, and each carries a different trait. Each trait will have an even chance of being recessive or dominant. Crank the random generator. The number of possible combinations is a stingy 8. Now, increase the number of chromosomes to 23. That's the number in a human gamete. Ah, The random assortment payoff is in excess of 8 million possible combinations of chromosomes in each gamete. But even this model of meiosis, with its staggering variation, is still an oversimplification because nature is more complicated. Working once again with a single diploid pair, our model gives us not 4 different gametes, but 2 pairs of identical gametes. At this stage of meiosis, the chromosomes carry out a maneuver called crossover. Note how the chromosomes exchange material. What is important as we watch the cell perform its choreography is the net result of the crossover. Not 2, but 4 distinct haploids, even more variation. Crossover and random assortment produce mind-boggling variation. The human zygote has 46 chromosomes, and by conservative estimates, 10,000 genes on each chromosome. Because of meiosis, the number of potential genotypes the individual might take on at conception is astronomical, more than all the molecules in the universe. Though Darwin wasn't familiar with meiosis, his intuition was uncanny. Evolution, he postulated, was the result of these countless minor variations, all adding up over the eons. But what was the chemical basis of these countless variations? In 1953, Watson and Crick reported that chromosomes are made up of molecules called DNA, the now familiar double helix. Untwisted, it resembles a ladder, with rungs of 4 key nitrogenous bases: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. The sequence of these bases makes up the genetic code. During both meiosis and mitosis, the DNA ladder unzips. Each half of the ladder rebuilds its complementary side from chemicals in the organism. One DNA strand becomes 2 double helix molecules. This DNA replication is the foundation of meiosis, a way of reshuffling genes to produce constant variation. Meiosis is a phenomenon that takes place at the level of the individual cell. During this process, genes are randomly rearranged, sorted, and parceled out to the gametes. Meiosis, endlessly reshuffling genes, is a main source of variation within a species. But as long as we dwell on the single cell at the microscopic level, it is easy to lose sight of the big picture, namely populations. Organic evolution is a large-scale event that happens to populations over long periods of time. A population represents an immense gene pool, an enormous reservoir of genetic variation. One source of this genetic variation is meiosis. Whether critters or turnips, each population carries the rich mix of genes for the next generation. However, this process of heredity does not itself change the gene frequency. We know from the Hardy-Weinberg model that the frequency for a specific allele is fixed according to this formula. Now, If we could observe a flourishing population of critters over generations and could detect a drop in the proportion of a specific trait, say hairiness, some agent, internal or external, has tampered with the population. Whenever the Hardy-Weinberg prediction fails, some form of selection may be at work, because the proportion of alleles should remain constant. If a population is trending towards, say, baldness, what is it about those bald critters that is allowing them to succeed? Darwin provides a lyrical answer. The vigorous, the healthy, the happy survive and multiply. For example, the fleet of foot, by escaping its predator, lives to pass on his attributes, meaning that alleles for fleetness gain a larger constituency in the gene pool. So, organic evolution can be defined as a change in the frequency of various alleles in a population. One key factor that maintains the fixed frequency of alleles in a population is random breeding. But what can disturb the equilibrium of alleles is yet another form of selection, identified by Darwin as sexual selection. If, for example, a member of one sex exhibits a more vigorous courtship than others of the same sex, by drawing more admirers, he donates a greater share of his genes to the gene pool. This rate of success has been popularly termed survival of the fittest. Not a very scientific term and never coined by Darwin. On the surface, it doesn't mean much. Those who are fit survive and those who survive are fit. This distribution curve of types in a population illustrates that natural selection tends to remove the extreme types. So fitness should not be judged exclusively in terms of superlatives or supremacy. In many populations, natural selection tends to favor the average. Species tend to be very stable, and natural selection fine-tunes populations according to seasonal changes. For example, sometimes favoring those with more hair, and other times favoring those with less hair. In the case of turtles, for example, natural selection seems to have eliminated the extremes and favored the average over 100 million years. Though much of selection tends to be stabilizing, evolution does take other tacks. If we could watch the distribution curve of a population, we might see natural selection begin to favor one extreme, so that over centuries, the population shifts in one direction. But does selection always skew a population in one direction? Not at all. It may act upon a population in such a way that the population splits in two directions. There is a profound implication behind disruptive selection. When a population takes off in two divergent directions, the phenomenon results in speciation, the formation of a new species, which brings us to a definition of sexually reproductive species: organisms that are capable of interbreeding. Though Darwin tended to differentiate species in terms of their physical attributes, he still must be given credit for recognizing the tug-of-war between mortality and fertility. The outcome, reproductive success, denies the role of a guiding hand in evolution. Still, there is another theory based on probability that supports Darwin's view by bearing out the stark aimlessness of evolution. Again, we use the Hardy-Weinberg formula as the benchmark. The model predicts genetic equilibrium as long as the population is large enough for the laws of probability to work. Now, if through some geological disruption, a small group is isolated from the prime group, when the isolated group breeds, the gene frequency may change, and change rapidly. To simplify matters, let us hypothesize that their sperm and ova contain an equal number of alleles for baldness and hairiness. The law of averages then predicts that the gene proportion should remain 50-50 in the next generation. But statistics in the short run can be downright quirky. Heads might fall 20 times in a row. The same phenomenon might tilt the alleles 60-40 in one generation and further skew the ratio 80-20 in the following generation until one allele is eventually lost altogether. In a population, this statistical shift is called random genetic drift. Over time, the isolated group may become subtly or radically differentiated. Should circumstances reintroduce the two populations, and they are incapable of crossbreeding, the breakaway group would now constitute a new species. The new species may not be more fit than the old stock. It simply comes to occupy a different niche in the world. So far, we have considered only the endless to and fro of what we might loosely call shop-worn genes. Yet, the fossil evidence chronicles a progressive march. One long upward climb from primitive forms to more highly developed organisms. How then does life lift itself up by its own bootstraps? Recycled genes can't pull off that trick. What then is the bootstrap mechanism that injects novelty into the course of evolution? Organic evolution is a large-scale event that happens to populations. A population represents an enormous reservoir of genetic variation. It is the recombination of genes that continually creates new phenotypes. Though most variations within a species are barely perceptible, these exaggerated critters illustrate how natural selection acts as the arbiter of change, decreeing which members will go the route of extinction and which will survive and thrive. So the process of evolution involves splitting, where extinction, which may be long and lingering, goes hand in hand with improvement. Through branching, a new species sprouts from the bones of the old, so to speak. The eventual disappearance of old forms and the appearance of new ones constitute the heart of Darwin's thesis. In the tree of life, Darwin saw a pattern where new limbs arise as old ones drop off. In his words, there is grandeur to this view where higher animals directly follow. Ah, but here's the rub. Higher means improvement to the species. And how can higher forms arise from the same shop-worn genes endlessly reshuffled in the gene pool? Once again, Darwin's intuition proved unerring, though his choice of words somewhat unfortunate. It is his wondrous monster which ultimately brings vigor to a population. though in real life it is very rarely this exaggerated. His wondrous monster symbolizes what we now call a mutation. Today we recognize two sources of variation: meiosis, which reshuffles the existing genes, and mutation, which is the more fundamental, because it is the prime source of variation. It is mutation that injects novelty into the population. To understand how mutation affects evolution, we must delve into the molecular world. The sequence of bases along the strand of DNA constitutes the genetic code. In a complex process called protein synthesis, the code sequence is transferred to a messenger molecule. The code is then transported to a miniature protein factory, the ribosome, where a specific amino acid is fetched in the order prescribed by the code. In this way, amino acids are linked in proper sequence to produce a protein such as insulin. These proteins, manufactured by the cell's machinery, are the very stuff of life, determining both the form and function of the organism. So the DNA code is the essence of life. But how can the DNA molecule undergo alteration? Shortwave ionizing radiation can strip electrons from atoms, thereby creating ions. A trail of ions in turn can form chemically active compounds, such as superoxides, which may ultimately alter DNA molecules. Another agent of mutation, long ultraviolet waves, are capable of breaking DNA strands. Finally, there are chemicals that can mimic DNA bases. A single change to a DNA molecule might produce a missing amino acid in a protein and render the cell dysfunctional. Of all the billions of DNA molecules in a complex organism, only those in the DNA of the sex cell need concern us. If in a gamete a change occurs in a base sequence, this change may enter the gene pool of a population as new information. When the change is passed on, it is called a mutation. A mutation then is a change to a gene that is inheritable. Are mutations ultimately beneficial or harmful? A mutant gene is beneficial if it gives the offspring some adaptive advantage. A mutant gene is harmful if it places a critter at a disadvantage. In the course of events, mutation is generally subtle because large and radical genetic change tends to be fatal to the organism. For example, a whole sequence of proteins may be necessary to build one essential chemical. If a genetic change alters only one protein, a vital chain of events may be interrupted and the organism rendered incapable of survival. Not surprisingly, many biologists have asserted that mutations affecting the ability of the gene to code for proteins are tiny changes that take place at a relatively slow, steady rate. But there is no hotter debate in the field of evolution today than the whole question of the rate of mutation and the rate of evolution. Take, for example, two mammals, the mouse and the elephant. If the agents of mutation bombard both species at the same rate, because there are more generations of mice than elephants, shouldn't the mice evolve at a faster rate? Another puzzling point. If slow and steady wins the race, why does evolution proceed more quickly in large-brained mammals than small-brained reptiles? Could the brain be speeding up the rate of evolution? And if the brain is superseding the role of natural selection, does its function threaten Darwinism? Certainly, if one word summarizes the rate of evolution, according to Darwin, it is gradualism. Darwin was convinced that evolution involved the accumulation of tiny, advantageous modifications. When the fossil records indicated a gap, Darwin was certain that the paleontological records were imperfect. The most recent challenge to Darwin is the theory of punctuated equilibrium. The gist of this theory is that species remain stable for long periods of time, only to suddenly evolve. According to this theory, the rocks tell the truth. There is no gap in the records. In a relatively short burst of time, measured in thousands of years, a species undergoes a major change and settles back into a long period of stability. Here is a comparison of the two patterns: gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. The one is smooth, the other shows leaps and bounds. Now squint. Their branching patterns look much alike. The theory of punctuated equilibrium then hardly spoils the luster of Darwin's vision. The final chapter is far from written. In Darwin's words, a grand and untrodden field of inquiry will be opened, where from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful, have been and are being evolved. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life." And God created every living creature that hath life. So vivid was the biblical account of creation that up to the 18th century, the concept of an unchanging world was fixed firmly in the minds of Christians and most scientists. Using the Bible as a record of time, theologians had calculated that the earth was very young. One professor had actually pinned down the day of creation at 9 o'clock, October 23rd, gave rise to what Buffon called degenerate types.
Pardon?
Buffon had hit upon two very modern notions. A species could diverge from an ancestral form, and a species could be modified by the environment. But there was another contemporary of his who saw in the pattern of nature progression rather than regression. Lamarck believed that each type of life form is the result of spontaneous generation. Beginning as a microscopic germ, the life form is driven by a need to become complex. Modification takes generations. Because the amphibian is simpler than the mammal, it must have had a later start. And lower forms later still. As for simple forms that abound, they would have originated quite recently. In Lamarck's scheme, living things form a hierarchy, similar in many respects to the chain of being. However, each type of organism advances separately. During this period, there was another assault on the notion of divine or special creation. The newfangled microscope, coupled with crude experiments, would reveal some serious flaws in the theory of fixed species. Believing that they had carefully sterilized their flasks, scientists boiled up a meat broth, only to observe days later a soup crawling with organisms. These results seem to suggest that life could arise spontaneously from a mix of organic material. Enter at this time le Comte de Buffon, who, using this erroneous information, came very close to formulating a modern theory of evolution. After the Earth had cooled down, he speculated that from the primordial mix, basic ancestral life forms arose spontaneously. As any one of these ancient forms, such as the cat, migrated about the Earth, its basic form would be modified by the creature's response to its environment. The original form, acting like a template in terms of being to the highest. This divine ranking was called the Great Chain of Being. However, by the mid-18th century, there was one naturalist who saw a different pattern of creation. Carl Linnaeus, concerned as much with earthly matters as heavenly, compared living things according to shared characteristics. He divided plants and animals into orders, families, genera, and species, and provided the basis of today's expanded taxonomy. Linnaeus used genus and species to identify and name an organism. His taxonomy, still used today, prodded scientists into looking at things very differently. If species were related through genus, could species have evolved from some form of prototype? The question caused the creation model to creak a little. 4004 BC. Because the period of creation was measured in a matter of 6 days, most scientists accepted as fact that the original forms of all living things were created at the same time. Taking the Bible as his guide, the idea of a perfect world designed by a creator would be powerfully argued by one Bishop Paley. Imagine, he asks, that you had never seen a watch. You would have to assume this intricate object had been designed by an intelligent creature. Now, look at the human eye. Anything as perfect as this lens could not have evolved on its own. Indeed, anything as complicated as nature must have been designed by a creator with a purpose. Behind his purpose was an order of being made to serve him. Fixed and unchanging, all beings were ranked in ascending order. From the lowest form